The air in the vast television studio hung thick and heavy, like a blanket that had been left out in the sun too long. It was the end of a long, grueling day of auditions for the hit show. City's Got Talent. The bright overhead lights had been beating down for hours, making the stage feel more like a desert than a performance space. The crew, a blur of black shirts and headsets, moved with a tired efficiency, their earlier energy long gone. They had seen a bit of everything that day. A fire breather who nearly set the curtains ablaze. A dance troupe whose synchronization was more chaotic than choreographed. And a singer whose voice was so shrill it made the camera lenses seem to flinch. Now, as the afternoon bled into evening, there was a collective sense of fatigue that settled over everyone. From the production assistants in the wings to the three figures seated at the long, gleaming judges' table, at the center of it all was the grand piano. It wasn't a pristine, gleaming instrument. It was a workhorse, scarred and nicked from years of being moved and played by countless hopefuls. Its once white ivory keys had yellowed with age and use. A fine layer of dust settled in the corners, visible only under the harsh glare of the spotlights. It sat alone on the stage, looking both majestic and lonely, waiting for its next player. Then a voice from the announcer's booth, flat and devoid of any real excitement, crackled through the speakers. And our next contestant is Agnes. There's no last name, just a simple single name. It hung in the air for a moment, followed by a polite but underwhelming smattering of applause from the audience. It was the kind of applause that people give out of obligation, the kind that barely makes a sound. A figure emerged from the side of the stage, stepping out of the shadows and into the blinding light. It was a woman, and she seemed to shrink under the intensity of the beams. She was in her late 70s, maybe even early 80s, with a cloud of neatly permed, silver-white hair that framed a face, etched with the soft lines of a long life. She wore a simple, pale blue cardigan over a floral dress, the kind of outfit one might wear to a Sunday church service or a family lunch. On her feet were a pair of sensible, low-heeled black shoes that made soft, shuffling sounds on the polished stage floor. She carried nothing but a small, worn leather handbag. She clutched with both hands as if it were a life raft. She walked slowly, each step deliberate and measured. It wasn't the slow, dramatic walk of a performer trying to build suspense. It was the slow, careful walk of someone for whom every movement required a conscious effort. The vastness of the stage seemed to swallow her. She was a small, unassuming figure in a space designed for big, bold personalities. The audience members, who had been buzzing with energy for the rock bands and magicians, grew quiet. Some shifted in their seats, others pulled out their phones, their faces illuminated by the blue-white light of their screens. This was not what they had come to see. This was, they assumed, the filler act, the sweet, sentimental moment before the final commercial break. At the judges' table, a silent conversation took place in the form of glances and subtle body language. The man in the expensive, tailored suit, a famous music producer known for his sharp tongue and even sharper business sense, leaned back in his chair and let out an almost imperceptible sigh. He ran a hand over his perfectly styled hair and glanced at his watch. He had seen this exact scenario play out 100 times. The sweet old lady who plays a simple, slightly off-key tune. The audience would go, "Ah." His fellow judges would say something kind, but non-committal. I think they would thank her for her time and send her on her way with a polite pat on the back. It was predictable. It was boring. Beside him, the woman with the vibrant, multicolored hair and a dress that shimmered like a disco ball gave a practiced, sympathetic smile. She was a pop star, a queen of catchy beats and spectacular stage visuals. She appreciated the sentiment, of course, but she lived in a world of high energy and visual spectacle. This quiet, elderly woman was a world away from her own. She picked up her pen, ready to write a simple, kind note on her scorecard. The third judge, a beloved comedian known for his quick wit and everyman charm, was the only one who didn't look immediately bored. He offered a genuine warm smile in Agnes's direction. He was the heart of the panel, the one who often found the humanity in the acts that the others dismissed. But even he had to admit, he was curious to see what this gentle-looking woman could possibly do to hold the attention of 1,000 people in a national television audience. He had a feeling he knew where this was going, but he hoped, just for a moment, he might be surprised. Agnes finally reached the center of the stage and the piano. She paused for a moment, her eyes taking in the massive dark space of the auditorium. The rows and rows of faces that were little more than shadows in the distance. Then, she turned her attention to the instrument in front of her. She placed her small handbag on the floor beside the piano bench, a simple, trusting act. She ran a hand gently over the top of the piano, her fingers tracing the familiar worn wood. It was a gesture of familiarity, of comfort, as if she were greeting an old friend. She sat down on the bench, which let out a soft, complaining creak. Her feet, in their sensible shoes, dangled just above the floor, not quite reaching the ground. She adjusted her position slightly, straightening the cardigan on her shoulders. Then she lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. Her fingers were thin and gnarled at the knuckles, marked with the brown spots of age. They were the hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime working, cooking, cleaning, gardening, and caring for others. They did not look like the hands of a virtuoso. They rested lightly on the yellowed ivory, still and silent. The studio was utterly quiet. The producer tapped his pen on the table, a sharp, impatient sound that echoed in the silence. The pop star examined her manicure. The comedian watched, his head tilted with a flicker of interest. Agnes just sat there, her eyes closed, her hands poised, a small, frail island in a sea of expectation and skepticism. She looked completely and utterly lost, a tiny speck of a person in a world far too big for her. The silence in the studio stretched on, becoming a presence in itself. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but a heavy, expectant one, thick with unspoken thoughts. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. The main camera, which had been focused on Agnes, began a slow, almost imperceptible zoom-in, as if trying to find some clue in her still, composed face. But there was nothing to read. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful. She might have been napping in her own armchair on a quiet afternoon. Rather than sitting under the glare of 1,000 spotlights in front of millions of viewers, the man in the expensive suit. The producer felt a familiar prickle of impatience. This was television. Time was money, and silence was dead air. He could feel the director's eyes on him from the control room, willing him to move things along. He shifted in his high-backed leather chair, the fabric making a soft squeaking sound that seemed to echo in the quiet. He thought about the stack of contracts waiting for him on his desk. The angry email from a chart-topping artist he needed to smooth over. The dinner reservation he was probably going to miss because this day was dragging on so long. This woman, this sweet little old lady, was an obstacle. A roadblock on the highway to the end of the show. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished surface of the judge's table. The movement was sharp, deliberate, designed to break the spell. He tapped his microphone, the sound a sharp thump that made a few people in the audience jump. "All right," he began, his voice smooth and professional, but with an undercurrent of brisk impatience. "Let's get things moving. Agnes, it's nice to have you here." The words were polite, but they were delivered with the warmth of a business memo. He didn't wait for her to respond. He glanced down at the paper in front of him, though he already knew it was blank. There was no backstory, no sob story, no dramatic pre-packaged video for this contestant. She had just walked in off the street. "So what are you going to play for us today?" he asked, already looking at his watch again. Just as Agnes opened her eyes and opened her mouth to speak, a voice, bright and chirpy, cut through the air like a knife. It was the pop star. She had a smile plastered on her face, a brilliant, blindingly white smile that she had practiced in the mirror 1,000 times. Her dress, a cascade of sequins and silk, caught the light with every tiny movement she made. "Oh, wait," she said, holding up a hand with long, perfectly manicured nails that sparkled with tiny jewels. "I have an idea." She turned to the producer, her eyes wide with a feigned theatrical excitement. "You know what I just love? I love the piano. It's so classic, so elegant. It reminds me of my grandmother's living room." She let out a little laugh that sounded like wind chimes, but it was a hollow, manufactured sound. She then turned her full attention to Agnes. her expression softening into one she probably thought was incredibly kind and encouraging. "Agnes, honey, you don't need to play some big, complicated thing for us. We just want to get to know you. How about you just play something simple? You know, just to warm up. Something we all know." She paused for effect, letting her idea hang in the air. The comedian judge watched her, a small, knowing frown playing on his lips. He had seen her do this before, turning a contestant into a prop for her own persona. The pop star clapped her hands together once. "I know. Play chopsticks." The words popped out of her mouth, bright and cheerful, but they landed in the studio like a lead balloon. A few people in the audience let out nervous chuckles. Others just shook their heads slowly. It was the most patronizing request imaginable. It was the musical equivalent of patting a child on the head and telling them to run along and play. It was a way of saying, "We don't expect anything from you. You are not a threat. You are a novelty. Amuse us, and then we will send you away." The producer nodded, a look of relief on his face. "Yes, that's a great idea," he said, though his tone suggested he was just happy to have a resolution. "Simple is good. Just a little something to show us you can play." He leaned back in his chair, his job done for the moment. He was already mentally checking out. The comedian, however, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He looked at Agnes, really looked at her, expecting to see a flicker of hurt, or embarrassment, or anger in her eyes. But he saw none of that. Her face was a calm, placid mask. She simply watched the pop star, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening to a bird singing outside her window. There was no shame in her posture, no defeat in her gaze. She just sat there, taking it all in, the pop star beaming. Thinking she had been wonderfully charming, leaned back in her own chair. "Yeah, chopsticks," she repeated to the comedian, nudging him with her elbow. "Wouldn't that be cute?" The comedian just gave a weak smile and turned his gaze back to the stage. The audience was starting to get restless again. The spell of the initial silence had been broken, and now they were just waiting for the predictable, cute little performance to be over so they could get to the next act. A phone buzzed somewhere in the front row. Someone else unwrapped a candy. The crinkling of the wrapper, loud in the now uncomfortable quiet, and then Agnes moved. It was a small movement, barely noticeable. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of agreement or of defeat. It was a nod of acknowledgement. She looked directly at the pop star, and for the first time, a faint, enigmatic smile touched her lips. It wasn't a big smile. It didn't reveal her teeth or crinkle the corners of her eyes. It was just a gentle upward curve of her mouth, a secret shared between her and herself. "All right," she said, her voice soft but clear. It was the first time she had spoken, and the sound of it was surprising. It wasn't frail or shaky. It was calm and steady, with a quiet strength that seemed to silence the rustling and coughing in the auditorium. "Chopsticks it is." With that, she turned her gaze back to the piano. Her hands, which had been resting in her lap, rose once more and settled above the keys. The producer picked up his pen, ready to write a quick no. The pop star adjusted her sequined dress, already thinking about what she was going to say after the performance. The comedian leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, a strange feeling of anticipation beginning to prickle at the back of his neck. The studio lights beat down, the air conditioning hummed, and 1,000 pairs of eyes watched as those thin, wrinkled fingers, the hands of a lifetime, poised themselves over the yellowed ivory keys, ready to play the simplest tune in the world. Her fingers, which had looked so fragile and arthritic just moments before, descended upon the yellowed keys. The first notes that rang out were exactly what everyone expected. It was chopsticks, in its purest, most basic form. 2 simple notes, played in a steady, childlike rhythm. Plink, 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 plink. The sound was thin and a little tinny, echoing the low expectations of the room. A few people in the audience nodded to themselves, a quiet "I knew it" passing through their minds. The producer picked up his pen, a small, satisfied smile on his face as he prepared to draw a large X on his scorecard. The pop star was already whispering something to the comedian, probably a witty remark she planned to use later. The simple, plinking melody continued, a musical joke that everyone was in on, except, it seemed, for Agnes herself. But then, after just 2 bars of the familiar tune, something happened. It was so subtle at first that many people missed it. While her left hand continued to play the simple, 2-fingered rhythm of chopsticks, her right hand did something else entirely. It broke away. A single, complex chord, rich and full, bloomed from the piano, hanging in the air like a sudden burst of color in a black and white photograph. It was followed by another, and then another, a cascade of intricate, jazz-inflected notes that tumbled over each other like a waterfall. The basic childish tune in her left hand became the steady, heartbeat-like anchor for a whirlwind of sound that was at once playful, technically dazzling, and completely unexpected. The effect on the room was instantaneous and electric. It was like a switch had been flipped. The board shuffling stopped. The phones, which had been held up to record a cute, forgettable moment, were slowly lowered. The audience members who had been whispering to their neighbors fell silent, their heads snapping forward to the stage. The low murmur of the crowd died, replaced by a new kind of silence, a thick, heavy silence of pure, unadulterated shock. At the judges' table, the change was even more dramatic. The producer's hand, which had been hovering over his scorecard, froze midair. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table, the sound unnaturally loud in the now silent studio. He didn't even notice. His entire body was rigid, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the stage. The bored, cynical mask had been shattered, replaced by an expression of raw, unfiltered astonishment. This wasn't just good. This was phenomenal. This was the kind of raw, undiscovered talent he spent his entire career searching for, the kind that legends were made of. Beside him, pop star's practiced, dazzling smile had vanished completely. Her mouth was slightly agape, her perfectly applied lipstick looking suddenly garish. She stared at Anis's hands, her own manicured fingers resting limply on the table. She was a performer who relied on backup tracks, on dazzling light shows, on a team of producers and songwriters. This was something else entirely. This was pure, unadulterated musicianship, flowing from the hands of a woman who looked like she should be baking cookies, not playing with the speed and soul of a seasoned jazz pianist. A flicker of something in V, maybe even a little shame-crossed. Her face before it settled into a mask of pure wonder. Only the comedian seemed to be enjoying the moment, without a sense of personal crisis. A slow, wide grin spread across his face. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, completely captivated. He had felt it. He had sensed there was more to this quiet woman than the others could see. He let out a soft, breathy chuckle, not of mockery, but of pure, unadulterated delight. He was watching a magic trick unfold in real time. And he was the only one who wasn't completely surprised by the magic itself. On stage, Agnes remained a study in stillness. Her eyes were closed, her face a canvas of serene concentration. Apart from her flying fingers, she barely moved. There was no dramatic swaying of the body, no showy flourishes. All the energy, all the life, all the decades of hidden passion were channeled directly into her hands. The chopsticks melody in her left hand was still there, a persistent, ghostly reminder of the condescending request, but it was no longer a simple tune. It had been transformed. It was the engine driving a locomotive of sound, the steady pulse beneath a skin of complex, soaring improvisation. The music she played told a story. It started with a playful tease, a musical wink at the judges and the audience. Then it grew more complex, more confident. The notes raced each other up and down the keyboard. A conversation between 2 brilliant minds that just happened to be contained within one person. It was mischievous, then soulful, then breathtakingly fast. It was the sound of a life that had been waiting for this one moment to finally, truly be heard. The simple tune they had asked for had become a vessel for a symphony of shocking, brilliant, and utterly beautiful reality. The playful, jazzy storm that had erupted from the piano began to subside. The intricate racing notes slowed their frantic pace. The complex chords softened, and the energy that had filled the room like static electricity began to dissipate. The simple, two-fingered melody of chopsticks in her left hand, which had been the steady heartbeat of the performance, faded into silence. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the studio lights and the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath. The audience, which had been leaning forward in their seats, captivated by the sheer technical brilliance, now settled back, but their attention was more focused than ever. They had been amazed, but now they were curious. What could possibly come after that? Agnes's hands, which had been a blur of motion, came to rest on the keys. They were still for a long moment. Then her right hand began to move again, but this time it was different. It was slow, deliberate. A single, clear note hung in the air, lonely and pure. It was followed by another and another, forming a melody that was starkly different from the jazz-infused fireworks of moments before. This new melody was simple, but it was heavy with a feeling that everyone in the room could immediately recognize. It was the sound of sadness. Not a crying, wailing sadness, but a deep, quiet ache, like the coldness of an empty house, or the feeling of a memory that is too painful to touch. The music was a raw, heart-wrenching classical piece, full of minor keys that seemed to sigh with longing. It spoke of a time long ago, of a love that was lost, of a dream that had faded away. Each note was like a drop of rain on a window pane, each chord a gentle wave washing over a shore of forgotten memories. The camera, which had been focused on her hands during the jazz performance, slowly panned up to her face, and there for the first time. The audience saw the true source of the music. Tears were streaming down Agnes's wrinkled cheeks. They weren't dramatic, sobbing tears. They were silent, steady tears, tracing glistening paths through the light powder on her skin. Her eyes were still closed, but her face was no longer a mask of serene concentration. It was a canvas of profound emotion. Her brow was furrowed slightly, her lips pressed together in a thin line, as if she were holding back a lifetime of pain. She wasn't just playing a song. She was living it, reliving it, right there on the stage, pouring every ounce of her unspoken grief into the worn ivory keys. The music was her voice, telling a story of loss that words could never capture. The effect on the room was profound. The shock of the previous performance had been intellectual, a marvel at her hidden talent. This was different. This was emotional. It was a gut punch. A young woman in the third row pulled a crumpled tissue from her purse and dabbed at her eyes. A tall, burly man in a leather jacket, who had looked bored and impatient when Agnes first walked on stage, was now staring at the floor, his jaw clenched tight at the judge's table. The transformation was just as powerful. The producer, the man who lived and breathed deals and dollars, who had built a career on being tough and cynical, looked utterly lost. He was no longer a judge on a talent show. He was just a man listening to another person's pain. He stared at Agnes, his own eyes glistening, a lump forming in his throat. He was thinking of his own father, of the funeral he had missed for a meeting, of the words he had never said. This music was bypassing his brain and speaking directly to his heart. The pop star, the woman who lived in a world of glitter and noise, looked completely humbled. All the artifice, the practiced smiles, and the manufactured charm had melted away, leaving behind a raw, vulnerable person. She watched Agnes, her own expression, a mixture of awe and sorrow. She had sung countless songs about heartbreak, written by teams of songwriters, but she had never felt anything as real as the quiet, aching melody that filled the silent studio. She realized in that moment that she knew nothing about true sadness, nothing about the kind of loss that etches itself so deeply into a person's soul that it can only come out through music. The comedian, the man who made his living from laughter, was not laughing. He had his elbows on the table, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking slightly. He wasn't crying for show. He was genuinely, deeply moved. He was a storyteller, and he recognized a master at work. This was the most powerful story he had ever heard, and it was told without a single word. Just as the sadness of the melody became almost too much to bear, it began to change. A single low note in the left hand began to repeat, growing louder, more insistent. The right-hand's sad melody was joined by another voice, a dissonant, angry chord. The pace began to quicken. The quiet ache of loss began to morph into something else, the fury of injustice. The music swelled, rising in a crescendo of sound that was no longer sad, but furious. It was a thunderous storm of chords, a torrent of anger and frustration. It was the sound of a woman who had been told she was not good enough, who had been overlooked and underestimated, who had fought against a world that didn't understand her. Her hands, which had been so gentle, were now striking the keys with a fierce intensity, her whole body rocking with the force of the music. This was the struggle. This was the fight. This was the decades of being quiet, of being ignored, all coming out in a glorious, rage-filled symphony of defiance. The storm raged on, a whirlwind of sound that was both terrifying and beautiful. It was the sound of a spirit that would not be broken. And then, just as it reached its peak, the anger began to subside. The furious chords softened, the frantic tempo slowed, and from the chaos, a new melody began to emerge. It was the same melody that had been so full of rage, but now it was transformed. It was no longer fighting. It was soaring. It was a breathtakingly beautiful and triumphant sound, full of light and hope. It was the sound of resilience, of finding peace after a long war, of seeing the sun after a lifetime of rain. It was the sound of a woman who had faced her demons and had won as this beautiful, triumphant melody filled the room. Something magical happened. The simple, childlike tune of chopsticks returned, but it was different now. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a condescending request. It was a heroic, poignant refrain woven into the fabric of the triumphant melody. It was a reminder of where she had started, of the simple tune they had asked for, and how she had taken it and turned it into an epic story of a life fully lived. The simple and the complex, the sad and the joyful, the angry and the peaceful, all merged into one single perfect sound. The music reached its final, glorious peak, a cascade of beautiful, hopeful notes that rose higher and higher before finally resolving into one last, resonant chord. And then there was silence. When the final, resonant chord faded, it did not leave a void. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a full, heavy thing, thick with the weight of what had just been shared. It held the ghost of the last note, the echoes of a life story told in melody and harmony. For a long, stretched-out moment, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the entire studio, every single person in it, had been frozen in time, caught in the powerful gravity of Agnes's performance. The air itself seemed to shimmer, still vibrating with the memory of the music, in the front row. A young woman who had been holding her boyfriend's hand now gripped it so tightly her knuckles were white. A tear she hadn't realized was forming finally broke free and traced a slow path down her cheek. In the back, a stagehand who had been leaning against a wall slowly slid down it until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. The world, for a few seconds, had stopped making its usual noise and had simply listened. At the judges' table, the three figures were statues. The man in the expensive suit, the producer, was staring at Agnes, his pen lying forgotten on the table. His face, usually a mask of controlled impatience, was now an open book of raw emotion. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide and glistening. He wasn't seeing a contestant on a stage. He was seeing his own mother, his own grandmother, every person he had ever dismissed or underestimated. He was seeing the vast hidden universes that exist inside. Quiet, unassuming people. And he was humbled. The pop star looked as if she had been struck. Her carefully constructed persona of glitter and confidence had been completely shattered, leaving behind something raw and real. She stared at her own hands, resting limply on the table, as if seeing them for the first time. She had sold millions of records with songs of heartbreak and triumph, but she knew, with a sudden and crushing certainty, that she had never truly felt a single note she had sung. Not like this. This was the truth, and it was breathtakingly beautiful and terribly humbling. The comedian, the man who made his living with words, had none. He just shook his head slowly, a look of pure wonder on his face. He wiped a tear from the corner of his eye with the back of his hand, a small, unconscious gesture of a man completely overwhelmed. Then, sound broke the spell. It came from the back of the auditorium, a single person rising to their feet. Their hands came together, not in a polite, rhythmic clap, but in a sharp, emotional burst of sound. It was a solitary crack in the silence, but it was enough. A person a few rows ahead heard it and stood up, adding their own applause. Then another and another. It was like a chain reaction, slow-motion wave of emotion rolling through the crowd. Within seconds, the single clap became a roar. The entire audience was on its feet, the applause thunderous and deafening. It wasn't just applause, it was a release. It was 1,000 people letting out the breath they had been holding for the past 5 minutes. They were not just clapping for a performance. They were cheering for the resilience of the human spirit, for the beauty hidden in plain sight. For the woman on the stage who had just given them a piece of her soul. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the studio. The producer was the first to move. He slowly stood up, his eyes never leaving Agnes. He picked up his microphone, his hand trembling slightly. He brought it to his lips, paused, and then spoke, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "Agnes," he began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "We came here today looking for talent. We asked you to play a simple tune." He paused, looking down at his hands, then back up at her. "You didn't play us a tune. You just played us your entire life story. And it was the most beautiful, heartbreaking, and inspiring thing I have ever heard." A fresh wave of applause washed over the studio. The pop star was crying openly now, her shimmering dress catching the light as she shook her head in disbelief. "Wow," she whispered into her microphone, the single word carrying more genuine feeling than any song she had ever recorded. The comedian just laughed. A joyful, tearful sound. "That's what music is supposed to do," he shouted over the noise. "That's it, right there." But the producer wasn't finished. He looked down at the panel in front of him, at the row of buttons. His eyes settled on one in particular, a large circular button gleaming under the lights. It was the golden buzzer, an honor reserved for an act so exceptional it deserved to be sent straight to the live shows. He had only ever pressed it once before for a young acrobat troupe that was technically perfect. This was different. This wasn't about perfection. This was about truth. He looked at Agnes, who was still sitting at the piano, her hands resting in her lap. She seemed dazed, lost in the afterglow of the music, only vaguely aware of the standing ovation and the praise being showered upon her. The producer took a deep breath. He didn't hesitate. He slammed his palm down on the golden button. A loud, decisive clang echoed through the studio, followed by the sound of a triumphant fanfare. Instantly, cannons on either side of the stage erupted, showering the air with a blizzard of gold and silver confetti. It rained down on the audience, on the judges, and most of all, on Agnes. She flinched at the sudden sound and movement, her eyes flying open. She looked up at the falling confetti, her expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at the cheering audience, then at the judges, who were now making their way onto the stage. The comedian was the first to reach her, wrapping her in a gentle, heartfelt hug. The pop star followed, her eyes still wet with tears, whispering, "You were amazing. Truly amazing." Finally, the producer was there. He knelt down in front of her, so he could look her in the eye. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, his expression one of profound respect and gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you for sharing that with us." And Agnes, the quiet, unassuming woman in the simple cardigan and sensible shoes, finally smiled. It was not the small, enigmatic smile she had worn before. It was not the smile of a performer who had just won a prize or a competition. It was a wide, radiant, beautiful smile that reached her eyes and lit up her entire face. It was the quiet, triumphant smile of a soul that had, after a lifetime of being silent, finally, truly, been heard. And as the confetti continued to fall around her like 1,000 tiny stars, She was no longer a small lost figure on a big stage. She was exactly where she was meant to be, a giant in a world that was finally big enough to see her.